First of all, Tanya, thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for inviting me and for participating in this conference. I got to tell you, to begin with, in terms of scheduling, I've got some nervousness right now because we started off, or when I came in, we heard about a really diligent investigation and prosecution of someone abusing their position of power. We were followed up before this with a really sort of moving dance and singing that we just came before us, and here I am talking about something that's really more technical about how to investigate and prosecute alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, all right before you have lunch. So nevertheless, with those challenges and barriers here, I'm going to do my best to address this tough topic and common topic too. I do want to tell you a little bit of our organization, AEquitas, just so I can do a quick poll. If you can raise your hands. How many people here have heard of AEquitas before Tanya mentioned them? All right, well, you can see how powerful our PR machine is, because about 3 of you have heard of it. Nevertheless, I don't want to eat up too much time telling you what AEquitas is or what we do, but essentially what we are is we're a nonprofit with a brick and mortar based in Washington, D.C., made up of attorney advisors like myself who were former prosecutors that specialized in crimes of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking. And what our job is at AEquitas now is to try to understand and learn about best practices for prosecutors, for investigators, and advocates and any kind of allied stakeholder working these kinds of cases, and trying to find methods that are going to be offender-focused and victim-centered. Now, how we execute this mission, this is a new clicker, so I'm curious if it's going to work or not, and it appears to have worked. Now, how we do this, probably the best way you can sort of see how we try to accomplish this mission is by checking out our website, AEquitasResource.org, where we have a variety of resources, written resources that are free to download and access. These address a variety of topics: how-to guides, strategy guides, case law compilations, statutory compilation, things of that nature. We do trainings on a national and sometimes international basis, as well as have a lot of archived webinar trainings that are available on our YouTube page. We're also available for consultations by contacting us through email or through a 1-800 number. The nature of these consultations, and the cost of this is totally free, by the way, these can be case-specific questions. Like maybe you hear what after I talk today, and hey, can you help me out? I want to call a forensic toxicologist at my case. Can you help me think of some direct examination questions? Or how the heck do I find a forensic toxicologist in my really under-resourced community? Or these can be broader questions, such as, wow, we're having some real trouble getting a multidisciplinary team started in our community. The prosecutor isn't buying in, law enforcement's not buying in, advocates aren't buying in. Can you help us brainstorm about ways to address it? If you reach out to us, and you don't have to be a prosecutor, you can be law enforcement, you can be an advocate, you can be a medical provider working with victims, and we're going to try to find you the answer. One of the things we really preach a lot about is the sort of force multiplier effect of multidisciplinary collaboration. So even when we don't know the answer at AEquitas, we work with a lot of other national technical assistance providers. So collectively, we can find a brain that can pretty much get the answer to any question you want to ask. And here, you can also follow us on the various social medias, although we haven't updated the Twitter logo, so maybe that doesn't look as tech-savvy as I would like. But you can also check out our website, where you can check out all these resources I've mentioned, trainings we've offered that are archived, a lot of things. It's a great thing to do if you're bored on a Saturday night, just sort of scope out our content and feast. And there's also our website, AEquitasResource.org, which is not intuitively spelled, but there it is. There's a selection of some of the special initiatives we're involved with, which I'm not going to be taking a deep dive into now, or I'm not going to get to talk about alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. Now, as I mentioned, or hopefully I referenced quickly, the services we provide, whether it's trainings, the time spent for trainings, whether it's the resources on our website, whether it's our consultations, it's at no cost to anyone here. And the reason we're able to do that is through grants provided, in this case, from the Office of Violence Against Women, the Department of Justice. However, the one caveat they always want us to give is hopefully nothing I say today you're going to find too disagreeable or unlikable. In the event you do, you should not assume it is the official position of OVW specifically or the Department of Justice generally. And of course, there's our fair use notice. That's a little awkward to be looking at a picture of me while I'm here talking to you all, but just a little bit about my background, just to give you context where I'm speaking of. Been with AEquitas for about 7 years. Prior to AEquitas, I worked as a prosecutor for about 20 years in Pennsylvania, where I still work remotely and am based. And it was in a little county called Berks County. If anyone's ever heard of the city of Reading, that's Berks County's big claim to fame. And I specialized in cases of child abuse, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, homicide, things of that nature. Some acknowledgments, because the work we do and the practices we try to talk about and learn about and teach about, we're not reinventing the wheel each time we do it. So I do want to give acknowledgement about a lot of the people who helped inform the content you're going to hear in this presentation are identified here. One of them is Mark LeBeau, the Chief of Toxicology at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's also really does a lot of work with the International Association of the Forensic Toxicologists. Terry Scalzo, who passed away but was a pioneer in this field of victim-centered, offender-focused practices, as well as Jen Summers, who's actually with PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum now. She's an attorney, a career prosecutor, but what's also interesting is she also has an undergraduate background in toxicology. So even though she's in the courtroom, she could actually be qualified as a forensic toxicologist if she wanted, which is a really helpful skill and an asset. So what are we doing in this presentation? How many people here are prosecuting or encountering or getting disclosures from victims who were victimized, who were sexually assaulted due to them being intoxicated, whether voluntarily or involuntarily? Can you raise your hand? So it's one of the most common challenges, and the reason why is for offenders, it's one of the most easiest ways for them to perpetrate. It's a vulnerability of victims that offenders have cultivated methods and practices that they can exploit. The most risky way for an offender to perpetrate against a victim is to use some sort of explicit force or threat. Now that definitely happens, but it's a lot riskier for an offender. Most offenders, when they perpetrate sexual violence, sexual assault, are looking to do so in a way that's going to avoid them being caught. A victim who's intoxicated has a vulnerability that an offender can exploit. And so what we want to do is, with a sort of appreciation that where most offenders are perpetrating these cases, it's not going to be in that sort of low-hanging fruit with explicit force or violence or threats that are still challenging. It's going to be in the really more challenging areas to investigate and prosecute, and more challenging for victims to come forward and to disclose and to be able to talk about what happened. And so we want to be able to get the offenders that are perpetrating sexual violence in this more sophisticated method, such as with victims who are intoxicated. So we want to get an understanding of toxicology with an eye towards being able to work with experts in a way that can help explain these issues to juries, to fact finders, so that they can understand these issues, so that they can understand how offenders perpetrated these crimes, how they planned these crimes, how they execute these crimes, and how they devised a way to escape accountability for these crimes and the acts which they committed. We want to talk about also using this force multiplier, not just siloing ourselves to our discipline. I keep walking away from the microphone. I apologize. Oh, I've got the handheld. I should be grabbing that. We want to talk about ways, everyone hear me okay? I think so. So we want to talk about ways that we can not just silo ourselves within our discipline and stay in our law enforcement tent, our prosecutor tent, our advocate tent, our medical provider tent, but how working together we can be greater than the sum of our parts and find ways to take all our specializations and our expertise and our disciplines and build stronger cases against these most difficult of offenders. So to kick off, let's define our terms. What do we mean by alcohol-facilitated sexual assault and tangentially drug-facilitated sexual assault? Now, sometimes people are requesting AFSA, as I call it, and DFSA in sort of separate buckets. But really, when you look at these cases or the reality of these cases, most DFSA cases are going to be perpetrated or committed in a context where someone is already imbibing alcohol, drinking alcohol, or becoming intoxicated, or has that vulnerability as a victim. So really, by learning about AFSA and learning about the toxicology issues that come up with AFSA, you're pretty well prepared or have a foundation to address these DFSA cases when they come up, which also presents some unique challenges in their own right. But what we mean by AFSA and DFSA cases is we mean where a victim is too intoxicated to consent to some kind of sexual activity or sexual content because there is a surreptitious administration of an intoxicant by an offender. By surreptitious, I mean a secret or sneaky administration. This might be something I hate using this terminology, but because it's colloquial, people might be familiar with it, like date rape drugs or things like that. There is a voluntary consumption of an intoxicant by the victim, or there is some combination of both. And usually, what's most common is going to be those second two: voluntary intoxication of the victim, or some combination of a secret or surreptitious administration or involuntary consumption by the victim. It's going to be pretty unusual. I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but it's pretty unusual for an offender to secretly administer an intoxicant to a victim, because usually it's going to be environment specific or in the context of the environment. If you're in the line at Walgreens or CVS or something and someone tries to slip you an intoxicant, there's not usually going to be much opportunity to follow up. Usually when an offender is going to have an opportunity to maximize their secret administration of an intoxicant or a drug that's going to make you more vulnerable, it's going to be in the context where you're maybe less inhibited, where your guard is down, where you're already having some drinks and drinking and doing that. So really the most common sort of areas where this crime is going to be perpetrated is where there's going to be voluntary consumption by the victim. And again, that voluntary is sort of used broadly. The voluntary intoxication might be pressured. There might be sort of providing drinks to the victim. But what we mean by voluntary is that the intoxication of the victim wasn't coerced. It might have been manipulated, but it wasn't coerced. So what makes these cases challenging? And for folks who've dealing with them, you can probably recognize a lot of the challenges, is that a lot of times there's a lot of embarrassment and shame when victims have been victimized as part of AFSA. Some of it might be, hey, look, I have to come forward and talk about a time when I was invulnerable. Maybe something when I was doing something embarrassing when I was drunk, when I was intoxicated. I have to come forward with that. Alcohol can impact and fragment your memory, so maybe sometimes victims' memories of what occurred, especially the nature of the content, might be vague or disconnected or difficult to put together. There's a lot of embarrassment about coming forward. And again, sometimes too, there's going to be sort of a preconceived notion of what a rapist looks like. And perpetrators who are using alcohol to commit their crimes, they don't fit into that stereotype. They're not the person in a trench coat popping out of an alley. That might be someone the victim knows or trusts, that felt relaxed with, someone that they met that they knew over a period of time, or that they have better, wider context for that offender, and so they just don't want to think of the offender as someone that can do it, did this. And like a lot of things, it's not just one of these factors that can be such a barrier for prosecution and also disclosure. It's usually going to be a combination of these factors at the same time. So these cases are challenging because when victims come forward, it's the exception to the rule. Like most sexual violence cases, sexual assault and rape, the assumption or rule is that a victim isn't going to come forward. The victims that do are the exception to the rule. Most offenders, however, they aren't just perpetrating against one victim and getting it out of their system. Most offenders are, when they decide that they're going to be the type of person that perpetrates sexual violence, sexual assault, they're looking for ways to do it more effectively. They're refining their techniques. They're perfecting their ways of selecting victims, identifying those victims, isolating those victims. So while most offenders have multiple victims, only a fraction of those victims are only ever going to come forward and disclose and talk about what this offender did, which is why when we receive those disclosures, no matter how challenging that context, no matter how fragmented that disclosure is and how disjointed and how tough it seems, this is a rare opportunity to likely hold an offender accountable who has multiple victims that are never ever going to be coming forward. What makes AFSA such a perfect crime is that it's a tool that's widely available. If an offender went around carrying a gun or a knife to perpetrate sexual violence against victims, chances are, I keep on moving for the camera too much, I apologize. Chances are that offender is going to be apprehended pretty quickly because that's sort of outside the social norms or social baseline. However, using alcohol, drinking alcohol, whatever your views on it about its impact or effects on our society, it's widespread, it's normalized. It's something that any offender can access, any person can go to use and do, and any time an offender can find victims that are going to be consuming and ideally maybe even manipulate the circumstances or conditions in such a way that a victim becomes more intoxicated than they otherwise would have. So this is going to be a ripe area because it is so normalized for offenders. It's sort of a great camouflage or way for them to conceal and perpetrate their crimes. Which is why when we talk about this, there's sort of a great theme in these cases is when you get this victim that comes forward, a lot of times there can be, instead of victim-centered, a victim-focused approach, like why was the victim drinking so much? Why did the victim leave themselves vulnerable? And sort of looking at what, trying to sort of take stock of the victim and identify what they did, quote, right or wrong. Rather than recognizing it from sort of an offender perspective or offender-focused type lens, which is, gee, alcohol, what a great tool for the offender. When an offender has an intoxicated victim or alcohol available, that offender doesn't need force. It doesn't need explicit coercion because alcohol is going to be doing the work for him. You don't need force when you have alcohol, which is why it's such an easier way for an offender to perpetrate. So how do we prove these cases? And most of the content of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be talking about how to prove it with an understanding, at least a 101 level understanding of toxicology and how toxicology works. But essentially how we're working, the one comment that was made in the prior presentation about putting these cases together, I forget the phrase, but I think it takes an army or something of that nature. That's exactly true. And in an ideal world, these cases would be investigated with the thoroughness that homicide cases are traditionally investigated, because you need that kind of effort in order to get all the evidence to apprehend the offender. But ideally, when we're looking at these cases, when we get that disclosure from the victim, as minimal or as challenging as it might be, we're wanting to build a case on something more than that victim's disclosure. That victim's disclosure is sort of the foundation or keystone for the rest of an investigation and ideally a prosecution. But what we're going to be looking at are all the circumstances to build a more holistic case. We're going to be looking at the totality of the circumstances, not just the victim's disclosure, and not just the victim's disclosure and maybe any statements the offender makes. But we're going to be looking at the scene, we're going to be talking to the offender's friends and network, the victim's friends. We're going to be looking for every witness and piece of evidence that can put together and sew together what happened before the assault, what happened during the assault, and what happened after the assault. But when we're trying to charge these cases and ideally investigate these cases, sort of the analytical framework about what to do or what I'm going to suggest to you is sort of a two-step analysis. Assuming what the victim says is true, does it constitute a crime or a violation of tribal code or state law or whatever jurisdiction we're working under? And assuming what the victim discloses constitutes a crime, if we assume it's 100% true, can we prove it in a court of law? Well, that first question there, assuming the version is true, does it constitute a crime? That's a legal question. And is it rape? Is it sexual assault? Here I'm going to be using South Dakota law. I know there's folks here who are working in tribal jurisdictions and might have different codes, but I'm going to be using South Dakota law as a baseline. And South Dakota, you may or may not appreciate this, but certainly I look at sexual violence laws from a lot of different jurisdictions. You actually have a pretty good code for this in South Dakota, so props to all of you. And I'm not supposed to comment on the quality or lack of quality of the legislation, but side note, you guys have a pretty good code on this. But here it talks about what rape is. Rape is an act of sexual penetration accomplished with any person under the following circumstances. And we're looking at, oops, sorry, had a hair trigger on that. We're looking at paragraph 4 here. The victim is incapable of giving consent because of any intoxicating narcotic or an anesthetic agent or hypnosis, and the perpetrator knows or reasonably should know the victim is incapable of giving consent. So we have to be able to show the victim knew the victim was incapable of giving consent, but also they were too intoxicated. And this is a lot easier than many jurisdictions that are you're trying to sort of package these cases under some sort of constructive theory, like, oh, the victim was incapable of giving consent. Here it specifies they're incapable of giving consent because of intoxicant. Some jurisdictions you have to sort of package this under they were mentally disabled, or they had a mental disability that prevented them from being able to give a consent. Your statute's pretty straightforward. You are blessed in South Dakota in that regard. Your case law also helps, and here's some case from 2023 from your Supreme Court, State versus Malcolm. An inability of giving consent is oriented to the time of the act of sexual penetration and contemplates the corresponding ability to withdraw consent at any time. There is no irrevocable consent. What's really useful and really good about this is when these cases come forward, you're going to have a lot of offenders that frame the situation or frame the scenario as the victim was flirting with me at the party, or flirting with me at the bar, or she tried to kiss me, or she was putting her hand on my shoulder. She was given indications that she really wanted it. And so when I got her back to her place, to my place, which is code for when I got the victim isolated and alone, I thought it was okay based on what the victim was earlier doing or the victim's actions. What South Dakota law makes clear is the offender, and how your Supreme Court has interpreted South Dakota law, is that's not something the offender can rely on. Now, it might impact their knowledge of an inability of consent, but if you have evidence of a victim being really intoxicated and the offender having evidence of that, the victim was slurring words, had trouble with motor skills, couldn't accomplish simple tasks, was vomiting, things of that nature, evidence of that sort of extreme intoxication, an offender then legally can't use this prior conduct of the victim to sort of build up a subsequent consent or assumption or presumed consent for later rape or non-consensual sexual activity. The other sort of attack you hear or defense you hear is it was just drunk sex. And this might be an interview with the offender in the nature of, well, you know what happened? We were drinking all night. I was really intoxicated. I couldn't really apprehend or grok that she was too intoxicated or he was too intoxicated to consent to sexual activity. So what am I going to do? We're going to be talking about with toxicology in a little bit that oftentimes when you have a biological male offender, sometimes that framing can be an overstating of intoxication on the offender's part that they're using to sort of cover up or conceal their crime. But legally, in South Dakota, as I understand your law, and I know I've got prosecutors here, so if I say something that seems outside your ken or understanding, let me know. Legally, that the he was drunk too is not a defense, a legal defense under South Dakota law. Voluntary intoxication under South Dakota law is only a defense to a specific intent crime. Specific intent means is when you committed an act is that you were purposely trying to accomplish the act. So intentional murder is when I hit him in the head with a baseball bat, the thought in my head was, I want to kill this person. So a specific intent version of rape would be when I penetrated the person, I knowingly wanted to say, I'm raping this person. As opposed to general intent, where the only thing you have to do is intend the physical action. So a general intent thing would be where you command your body to penetrate the victims, to sexually penetrate the victim. So what the courts have held is in South Dakota, rape is a general intent crime, which means this sort of voluntary intoxication, an offender saying I was drunk too, does not work as a legal defense under South Dakota law. And this can be confusing for a jury, and if your standard jury instructions don't already make this clear, I would request from your courts that they specifically charge the jury on this. Under South Dakota, voluntary intoxication is not a legal defense to rape. And do the homework for the court, show your work so they know where this instruction's coming from. All right, so that's sort of a very brief overview of at least what this East Coaster's understanding of South Dakota law. But let's get into legally, so we get a disclosure. Can we prove it? It's pretty broad under South Dakota law because you have such a good statute. But can we prove it? And really what we want to do, the big issue, and there's a lot more to this, but what we're going to be focusing in the time given to us is going to be toxicology and an understanding of toxicology. Now, a lot of people think, because again, each of us probably has personal experience with drinking, maybe with drinking too much, and I'm sure it's not anyone here personally, but you know someone who's maybe gotten intoxicated in the past and has drank too much. So it's not you, it's a friend of yours. But each of us kind of think of ourselves as experts on the issue. Like, oh, gee, I understand this stuff. But really, toxicology is a deeper issue, and there can be a real gap in not knowing what we don't know. And this gap of not knowing what we don't know, it's going to be existing in our courts and our jury pool too, because again, it's the sort of thing that everyone thinks they know about because it's so pervasive and so common, but a lot about the physiology of toxicology isn't generally understood. Let's start with some basic toxicology. One, alcohol, despite the idea of being sort of a lubricant, a social lubricant, to get you going to parties and make it fun, what alcohol is classified as, ethanol alcohol specifically, it's a depressant, specifically a central nervous system depressant. And by depressant, I'm not trying to characterize it as something that makes you sad or feel bad, although for some people, drinking too much can certainly do that. What I mean by a depressant is it's sort of relaxing and inhibiting and impairing the different parts of your body. Initially, the sort of your prefrontal cortex, and then as you drink more, other parts of your body. CNS depressants, central nervous system depressants, they impair your cognition and your physical motor skills. If anyone has had surgery or something of that nature, when you go under and you get surgery, when you get that anesthesia, that's an effect of a central nervous system depressant. Now, not everyone's had surgery. This is an analogy I've only thought of with age. I didn't think of in my 20s and 30s when I was doing these cases. But if you get a colonoscopy, that's when you're getting a central nervous system depressant, so that, I mean, God willing, you're with your provider, so the colonoscopy can be successfully performed on you. The other basic point about central nervous system depressants, and this is sort of when you think about it, of course, but you don't want to forget this point. As your consumption increases, alcohol or any depressant can progressively impairs your bodily functions and ability. So if you drink one, you're impaired on some level, maybe not a noticeable level. The more you drink before your body can process it out, the more impaired you can become. Now, how does alcohol impair you? Or how does any sort of central nervous system depressant impair you? Well, here's a very sophisticated diagram of your brain. What happens is, when alcohol enters your body, when you consume or imbibe alcohol, the chemical ethanol alcohol or ethyl alcohol enters your bloodstream. Your blood, as we all know, circulates through your body. The blood circulates through your brain. The oxygenated blood is what keeps our brain alive and keeps our brain functioning. As a certain percentage of that blood becomes not oxygenated blood, but ethanol alcohol, then that brain becomes impaired. Now, how that impairment happens is initially the part that becomes impaired is going to be this prefrontal cortex. This is going to be the more evolved portion of our brain. This is the part that helps us strategize and plan and think, inhibits us from doing embarrassing things on some level. this is the part that gets first hit as we consume alcohol and as it becomes an increasing percentage of our blood. So this is a part that becomes first impaired, and this is a part can be kind of dangerous. This is the part that's helping me sort of plan to finish this up before lunch, what we're going to do tonight, which breakout sessions we want to be going to, everything of that nature. If one of you have to use the restroom right now, this is the part of your brain that's working out how you can quietly exit to use the restroom. As alcohol starts circulating in an increasing degree throughout your bloodstream, other parts of your brain become impaired. And the different parts of the brain, it goes from the most evolved portions of the brain to your most least or primary sort of reptile level of brain. And this is going to be the area covering movement and sensations. So as you drink more, your motor skills become impaired. You don't feel pain as much. Your vision becomes impaired as you progressively drink more. You get blurry-eyed. Your coordination starts failing, etc. And as alcohol impairs you, it doesn't move from the prefrontal cortex to the movement area to the vision area. It's continuing to progressively impair your judgment as it's going through. It's still impairing the different other areas of the brain. As you really get into higher levels of intoxication or consumption, it starts going to your basic sort of base levels of your brain, your reptile brain, the area that controls memory. Here's your hippocampus. I should say organizes memory. There's some dispute about that. And also, I can't read it, and also sort of the most primal areas. Now, how alcohol is supposed to work, or any central nervous system depressant is supposed to work, is as it goes through your bloodstream, it knocks you out and becomes unconscious. And so then you don't understand what's happening to you, and you're passed out, and etc. Where it gets complicated is if you have a lot of experience drinking and your tolerance level goes up, is it doesn't knock you out at the level where you would usually pass out, and your brain, it starts impairing the levels of your brain that controls the involuntary portions of your body, like your heart rate, your breathing, things of that nature. And that's when you can die of alcohol poisoning, because it sort of knocks out the part of your brain that's controlling those basic sort of life-sustaining physiological functions. So here's another really sophisticated diagram talking about what I just explained, and I probably should have slept to that. Now, the other thing that happens is, and this is, I'm not going to go through each of it, but as you become impaired, there's going to be sort of indicia or indicators of intoxication as you progressively become more intoxicated. And this lines up generally with different levels of blood alcohol content, or BAC. This isn't perfect because, again, the sort of symptoms you display can be sort of impacted by your level of experience, or basically your tolerance for consuming alcohol, which is one of the things when we're talking to offenders and when we're talking to victims, we want to ask them, like, what's your experience drinking? And we're not doing this to shame them or embarrassing them, but we're trying to get a baseline of essentially what their tolerance level might have been, or how it might be impacted by past experience of drinking. But why this is critical is because at certain levels, certainly at these lower levels, this generally, and I'm not going to say categorically, but usually the initial levels of intoxicated, your prefrontal cortex is impaired, but it might not be so impaired that you didn't have an inability to consent, just like you might be sort of minimally impaired, but not so impaired you can't drive a car. But it's at the higher levels of intoxication where someone is too intoxicated to consent to sexual activity. The legal limit for not being able to drive a car is 0.08. But what this means in terms of this holistic investigation is when we're talking to our witnesses, when we're talking to third parties, when we're looking at electronic evidence or pictures or videos that were taken at the bar or at the party of the victim, we're trying to find people talking about what kind of indicators of intoxication did the victim show that they were drunk. Compared to what the offender says. Was the victim stumbling? Did they need help? Could they work the security password on their phone? Were they able to hail an Uber? Did they have to be helped into the car? Could they drive? Would you feel safe giving them the keys to a car? And these are the kinds of questions we want to be asking witnesses about our victim and our offender, so that we can sort of establish what kind of indicators the victim was or wasn't given, what our evidence shows about whether the victim was visibly too intoxicated to consent. So even if the offender says, hey, I didn't know she was too intoxicated to consent to sex, if everyone at the party says our victim was falling down drunk or slurring her words, the victim's sort of version of events becomes a lot less believable, a lot less credible, and sounds a lot more like a cover-up. What this also means is, with this sort of holistic investigation, you don't need a blood alcohol level or a SANE exam with a chemical poll of the victim or a blood poll of the victim to establish your BAC to prosecute these cases. You can use other evidence, eyewitness evidence, and other secondary evidence to establish the victim's level of intoxication. It does not rely just on BAC results for these cases to be confusing. The other thing about alcohol that's critical is the average absorption rate. And again, this is not really an exact science here because it's going to depend on a variety of factors. But the average time it's going to take for a serving of alcohol to be absorbed into the blood is going to be approximately 30 minutes. And this can vary by be as quick as 15 minutes or as long as 90 minutes. So gee, what the heck use is that, Kurland? You're telling me like a serving of alcohol gets absorbed into the blood in 15 to 90 minutes. That's a really large time frame to figure out these cases. But this is why when we build these investigations, when we build these cases, when we're interviewing victims, when we're interviewing witnesses, we want to find out as much about the different kinds of variables that can impact how quickly or how slowly alcohol gets absorbed into the bloodstream. The other thing that's critical to remember about this absorption of alcohol into the bloodstream is once alcohol gets absorbed into your bloodstream, is it doesn't matter whether you're drinking beer or whiskey, it's the same chemical. So there's not a different kind of intoxicant that's going to cause a different sort of vibe or feeling. You might sort of psychosomatically think that, but there's no sort of clinical or physiological basis to believe that. And once it's in your bloodstream, the only thing that's going to be able to process it out is time. It's not the shock of being raped or the fear of being raped that's going to magically make you sober and in control of your faculties or anything of that nature. The only thing that can process alcohol out of your body is going to be time, which is critical to remember because there can sort of be an assumption or a misconception, I should more accurately say, on the part of some people out there that, well, if I was being raped, I would be shocked into being sober. I would be able to know to yell for help or call for help or exit or resist or something of that nature, which is a common understanding, but it's also an incorrect understanding, any more than when you go to a doctor and they test your reflexes that by will alone you can keep your knee from kicking. You can't will yourself to be sober through anything other than time. You can't give them a cold shower. You can't give them a cup of coffee. If you do that, the only thing you're going to have is a wet, cold, and wide awake, intoxicated person. But they won't magically become sober. So what impacts this absorption? Well, this is one forensic toxicologist can be useful because with enough information, a forensic toxicologist can extrapolate what a person's level of intoxication could have been at a given time, but only if we're able to give that forensic toxicologist enough information. The kinds of variables that are going to impact intoxication is going to be whether or not the person ate anything. Someone with an empty stomach is going to become intoxicated more quickly than someone who has food in their stomach. Their body size. The bigger a person is, then the more gradually alcohol gets absorbed into their bloodstream. The smaller it is, then the smaller they are, then the more quickly. But again, this can sort of be impacted too by what someone's percentage of fat tissue versus muscle tissue is, as we're going to discuss. The amount and type of alcohol that they're drinking. So if someone is drinking shots where the alcohol is more concentrated than in beers, they're obviously their blood alcohol is, the alcohol is going to get absorbed into their blood more quickly. The duration of their drinking, in other words, if they're drinking at a rate more quickly than before it can be processed it out, that's going to increase the rate of absorption. Whether they're tired, if you're more fatigued, alcohol is going to be absorbed into your bloodstream more quickly rather than slowly. Your experience drinking, your tolerance, whether you're combining alcohol with other drugs. So again, these are the kinds of questions we want to be talking about with our victims and our offenders too, because we want to sort of apprehend whether they were legitimately intoxicated or not intoxicated. But we want to ask these questions about our victims in a trauma-informed way. Probably a non-trauma informed way to ask a question of the victim is, how much do you weigh? And it's like, well, gee, is this person trying to body shame me? I think it's probably important you give the context for the victim. Listen, we want to try to understand how intoxicated you would have been at this incident, how quickly or slowly. And one of the things that help us understand that is your weight. Do you remember how much you weighed at the time that this event happened, or the day you were drinking before you were victimized? What did you have to eat that day? Where did you eat that day? Because again, if we find out where they ate, maybe we can corroborate what they were eating that day. And that detail is going to be really helpful to sort of establish what happened before. Tolerance rates. Again, we're not trying to shame our victim and make them feel like a drunk or junkie or anything like that. But again, pulling back the curtain, showing the secret sauce, letting the victim know the reason why we're asking these questions is because we want to be able to help you, and understanding how quickly or slowly you could have become intoxicated. And this is some of the information we need to help understand that. Again, there's trauma-informed ways and there's non-trauma-informed ways. And if you want to have a victim shut down and not be able to participate, try framing these questions in a non-trauma-informed way. So where does alcohol get absorbed in your body? Generally speaking, where the majority of it gets absorbed is going to be in the small intestine. This is a pretty big, any medical providers in the audience today? Nurses, say nurses, doctors? Okay, so I'm talking to the converted here, you already know. But the small intestine is a pretty big part of your anatomy. It's all nicely and neatly contained here in our abdominal area. But if for some macabre reason we were to actually sort of understand the surface area of our small intestine, if we pull it out, it is essentially, and I forget, it's the length of a tennis court or half a tennis court, but it's a pretty big organ. And this is when what we consume, whether it's food or whether it's alcohol, when it's in a liquid form, this is where it's broken down and then through the tissue is then distributed through the rest of our body, including our bloodstream. So if alcohol goes straight from our glug, glug, glug mouth into our small intestine, we're going to get intoxicated a lot more quickly. If we can keep the alcohol in our stomach for a longer period of time, the alcohol can get absorbed into our bloodstream in a more gradual manner. Now, what can keep alcohol in our stomach for a longer time? Food. Because what happens is when we consume food, the part of our stomach called the pyloric valve, it shuts down so the acids in our stomach can start breaking down our food into a way so it can be more easily processed in our small intestine. So if we have some food before we're drinking or while we're drinking, that pyloric valve shuts down, and essentially the alcohol we consume has to sort of sit in our stomach and to be processed rather than going straight to the small intestine. Which again is one of the reasons why we're asking our victims, tell me what you had to eat that day or didn't eat, or had to, so we want to find out whether the alcohol went straight to their small intestine and just got kicked right into their bloodstream, or had an opportunity to be more gradually processed in their stomach. Which is, again, if you know people in their late teens or young adults who probably party or go out drinking, I mean, ideally, you don't want to be binge drinking because you can become so vulnerable when you're intoxicated. But having been a young adult myself, not every young adult listens to wisdom. What you do want to advise is, well, if you are going to do that, make sure you at least have something to eat before you do so, which is not something young adults always do, ready to go out and paint the town. The other factor affecting absorption rates is going to be body fat percentage versus muscle tissue percentage. And the reason why is where there's fat, what happens is it keeps that alcohol concentrated into your bloodstream because it can't penetrate or escape or disperse through fat tissue. If there's muscle tissue or a greater proportion of muscle tissue, then that alcohol can more easily displace into that watery muscle and the concentration in the blood decreases. Now we're getting to that point pretty soon where a lot of male suspects, biological male suspects, sort of say that I was drunk too defense. A lot of times that's going to be a cover-up or concealment. What this means functionally is that if there's a higher, alcohol will not leave the blood and enter fat. Alcohol will leave the blood and enter muscle. So the more muscle you have, the lower your BAC. The higher the fat you have, or the more fat you have, the higher your BAC is. So muscle means lower BAC, fat means higher BAC. That point right there. Now, as a generalization, and I'm speaking in terms of biological sex, not necessarily gender here, but the average biological male, and again, this is average, not categorical, they have a greater percentage of their body composed of muscle and water than the average biological female. And there's a statistic for that. So what this means is that for a given amount of alcohol, let's say in this case, 6 12-ounce beers over 2 hours, and assume each of this male and the female, they each have comparable BMIs, body mass index. It means because that average biological female is going to have a higher quantity of fat percentage as opposed to muscle percentage than the biological male, that the biological female's BAC is going to be higher than the male's for the same amount. And here we are, a 140-pound male. This might be a shorter male. The female might be taller than the typical female, but BMIs are essentially comparable for both of them. Taking another example here, if you sort of increase this to a 190-pound male and maybe a smaller female, 125-pound males, again, same amount, same time, 6 12-ounce beers over 2 hours, and assuming all these other variables are equal, such as tolerance rates, whether or not they ate, fatigue, and issues like that, the male's BAC is going to be between 0.09 to 0.11, which is just above the legal limit for presumptively being unable to drive. The female's is going to be really high at 0.19, 0.21, potentially higher than the male's. So if you have a male suspect saying, oh, she was drinking just as much as me, we were drinking together, I was way more drunk than her, or just as drunk as her, a lot of times that's going to be what in the field we call a lie or a deception. And that's it. Why is someone lying? It's like, and again, this is a dated enough political reference, I think I can use it. It's like Watergate. It's what makes it look bad is the cover-up. And if you got an offender sort of overstating their level of intoxication, it's pretty good proof that they're trying to get away with, again, another legal term, doing something naughty. Because that's why offenders lie, that's why they misrepresent, and that's why they're trying to deceive. And this is great evidence to show you knew what you were doing was wrong, which is why you overstated how intoxicated you were with me when I interviewed you. Because a lot of times the offenders in these cases are going to be a lot of times willing to talk to investigators. Not all the time, but again, they might be framing themselves, they either want to crap talk the victim about what a drunk or lush or intoxicated, or they want to talk about how great they are, that they were trying to help this intoxicated victim to get home and things of that nature, and put themselves in the best light. So what's interesting though, despite these biological realities, it doesn't match with sort of societal presumptions we have, and including that a lot of victims have about themselves. A victim of alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, it's usually like, well, why'd you go somewhere where you became so vulnerable? Why'd you drink so much? What did you think would happen? It's sort of like the sort of attitude you have, why would you go through Central Park at night where you could get mugged or robbed or things of that nature, rather than focusing on the perpetrator. Instead, the perpetrator, when they claim intoxication, it's often framed as, well, can't hold him responsible, he's just some poor drunk guy. And really, when you think about it, especially if you have younger victims, we sort of ascribe to an offender's an inability to control what they do because their inhibitions are so relaxed. How could they stop themselves? I guarantee you, if someone would walk in the room, they would be able to stop. If the victim's father walked in the room, the offender would have no trouble stopping and, dare say, finding a way to escape through the window or some of that nature. So again, that's sort of a minimization and excuse making for the offender. The other thing to remember too is, well, certainly at the lower levels of intoxication, alcohol can certainly relax your inhibitions and maybe make you more open to choices you wouldn't have other made, including bad choices. At the higher level of intoxications, alcohol is a depressant. At the kinds of levels of intoxication we're talking about for alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, it's not an aphrodisiac. It doesn't make a lot of people want to feel the get going as it was. And so a lot of times when they talk about, well, she was more ready to go because she was so intoxicated, they're confusing an earlier stage of intoxication with the kinds of intoxication that are usually at issue for alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. So I do want to talk about blackouts and passouts, the difference between them. Blackouts, of course, what they are is that there's a period of memory loss, but you're still able to function. Essentially what happens with a blackout is you're still conscious, but you're just not able to retain any memories of that event. Your brain's ability to form long-term memories is basically impaired. Now, how do blackouts happen? It's not just determined by a high level of BAC, it's more determined by a rapid rise in BAC. And how the defense uses a blackout is to suggest, well, look, during the time the victim was blacked out, the victim thought they were unconscious, they were actually blackout, and in this period the victim can't recall, they consented to sexual activity. Well, when we want to sort of do to counter that defense, and again, sometimes a victim really was blacked out when the assault occurred, but sometimes a blackout is sort of misrepresented by the defense, and we really want to examine that by trying to find evidence about how quickly the evidence was drinking. Was there a rapid rise in consumption of alcohol? And again, if there's not much evidence that the victim was rapidly drinking a lot of alcohol in a short period of time, the claim of a blackout defense might not be credible. But even when someone is blacked out, they can still give indicators of intoxication that doesn't make it okay to have sex with them, to touch them, which doesn't make them magically capable of consent. Passouts are a little different, though. That's where you're actually unconscious. So the biggest challenge when there's a passout is the victim trying to remember or understand what happened to me, because a lot of times they don't have that knowledge. It's going to be similar in sedation to like when you go under. There's going to be a sedated state associated with surgery. So again, if a victim describes being groggy in a way that's sort of more comprehensive than a typical hangover, and lingering for a period of 24 hours, that also sort of contradicts any sort of defense claim that the victim was blacked out, and the evidence is more consistent with a passout than a blackout. So I do want to talk a little bit about drugs, DFSA sexual assault. This is going to be similar in action to the central nervous system, similar in effects on the body. It essentially makes the victim more vulnerable so that they can be victimized. Drugs act more quickly and they leave the body much more quickly. The biggest mistake we can, I think, often make in a DFSA case is relying on the viability of the investigation or prosecution by whether or not there's a lab result. Because a lot of times a sort of forensic examination or forensic test for drugs, it's going to be gone by the time the victim is going. First of all, DFSA cases are a lot more susceptible to delay reporting. So you're probably not going to have a time for a traditional sexual assault forensic medical exam, but most of the drugs in their body would have already dissipated. The other challenge with relying on lab results for a DFSA prosecution is there are a lot of different drugs that can be used to facilitate a DFSA case. Last they were categorized, I think it's over 150 different drugs. And the problem is there isn't one sort of universal drug screen that tests for all of these. For you to successfully test for a specific drug with a victim of DFSA, the victim has to be examined right away. You have to know what drug was being used, and you have to use the right test or screen that can detect that drug. The other sort of challenge is even if you have a quick complaining victim, you know what drug is being used, there's different manufacturers of these screens. So manufacturer A might have a lower threshold for a positive result than a manufacturer B, which might require a higher threshold for a positive result. So these test results aren't the be-all and end-all for whether or not someone was a victim of a drug-facilitated sexual assault. Really what we have to rely on, it's similar to what they did in the Cosby case, where there wasn't any sort of forensic screening to show that drugs were used to facilitate the sexual assault. You have to be able to talk to the victim, listen to them. What symptoms did they suffer? How do you feel? Maybe consult with a forensic toxicologist and say, what kind of substances are similar or consistent with this in the victim or could cause this sensation? And usually what the description you might get from a victim is, I had 2 or 3 drinks and I couldn't control my body. I didn't feel like I normally do when I'm intoxicated, or I just felt so overwhelmed. That's when our antenna should go up. Well, gee, maybe some sort of drug was used to facilitate it, and let's see how we can prove it. And listen to the victim and trust the victim on that. The other thing is, too, that when we're listening to the victims in these cases, and I'm running out of time and I want to make sure to get this point on, is the other thing, both in alcohol-facilitated sexual assaults and drug-facilitated sexual assaults, it can certainly impair our memory, which we've discussed, because it can lock out or block certain areas. But alcohol is not a hallucinogen. What I mean by this is the things a victim is able to remember, they don't become unbelievable or incredible simply because the victim is intoxicated. So if you have a victim who remembers saying no, but doesn't remember much else, that remembering saying no isn't unreliable just because they were intoxicated. And a good illustration of that is, I should ask you all to raise your hands, but think to your, has anyone here ever, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands because I don't want you, has anyone here ever done something embarrassing when you were intoxicated? Or someone you know has done something embarrassing when you were intoxicated? How often did you find out the next day or the next morning that, oh, whew, it looks like I just imagined that embarrassing thing, the going up to sing karaoke? No, in point of fact, that embarrassing thing you did when you were intoxicated, it was not, your memory was not so unreliable that you imagined doing that embarrassing thing. You really did do it. There might not be other things you remember, but that one bad karaoke singing really did happen, even despite it embarrassing you. Which is critical, of course, if that victim remembers saying no. So, folks, I know better than, as much as I know you'd all like to stay and delay your lunch, I think it's important I not keep you from your lunch, or my evaluations are just going to look horrendous. Which would be the awful thing happening. But essentially, going forward, what we want to do is apply a basic understanding of toxicology to AFSA and DFSA cases, conduct comprehensive, holistic investigations of these AFSA and DFSA cases, and again, do it from an offender-focused, with an offender-focused lens rather than a victim-focused lens, and be victim-centered. So, folks, thank you very much for your time, and I think we got a great lunch coming up, too.